History often remembers Isabella of France with a single, savage epithet, the She-Wolf of France. It's the kind of title that sticks to the imagination, conjuring visions of a queen prowling in the shadows, dangerous, untamable, and dripping with scandal. But behind that name lies one of the most calculated and vicious smear campaigns of the medieval era, a deliberate construction of lies that would echo through centuries. Isabella's story is not just about betrayal or ambition. It's about how political enemies can twist reality until the truth is unrecognizable. The 14th century was an age steeped in superstition, where the written word could immortalize slander, and whispered rumors in a drafty corridor could shift the balance of kingdoms. In such a world, a black legend wasn't just gossip, it was a weapon. And Isabella's black legend, complete with the most depraved allegations imaginable, began when she was barely a teenager. The year was 1308. Isabella, only 13 years old, was no ordinary princess. She was the daughter of Philip IV of France. Philip the Fair, a monarch as feared as he was admired. Philip's reign was a study in calculated dominance. He had orchestrated the downfall of the Knights Templar, bullied the papacy into submission, and solidified France's place, a continental powerhouse. For him, every child was a strategic asset, and Isabella was perhaps his most valuable. Her marriage was not about love. It was about forging a bond between two uneasy neighbors, France and England. This was a period when Europe's monarchies were locked in a constant dance of diplomacy, war, and marriage alliances, each move designed to gain advantage without open battle. England, under King Edward II, was both a potential ally and a frequent rival. Philip knew that by marrying Isabella to Edward, he could secure influence across the Channel provided his daughter could navigate the notoriously treacherous English court. But from the moment Isabella stepped onto English soil, the cracks began to show. England in the early 14th century was a land of simmering unrest, with powerful barons challenging royal authority and a king whose personal inclinations were about to cause political upheaval. Isabella arrived expecting to be crowned queen and to stand beside her husband as an equal partner in the realm's governance. Instead, she quickly discovered she was little more than an afterthought. Edward II was unlike most medieval kings. While rulers were expected to prove themselves in war, tournaments, and the hunt, Edward's heart was elsewhere, captivated not by his new bride, but by a man, Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was no mere companion. He was the king's favorite in every sense of the word, a Gascon noble whose charm, wit, and audacity had won Edward's absolute devotion. For Isabella, the reality was devastating. At the wedding itself, a ceremony meant to bind the kingdoms in splendor, Edward's attention was fixed entirely on Gaveston. Chronicles record that the king lavished his favorite with gifts meant for the queen, including jewels that had belonged to Isabella's mother. The court noticed, the nobles whispered, and Isabella, 13, alone, and far from home, was left to endure the public humiliation in silence. But here is where Isabella's character first reveals itself. She did not crumble under the weight of embarrassment. She did not plead or pout or retreat entirely into the passive role expected of her. Instead, she watched, she listened. She began mapping the terrain of her new political battlefield, noting the alliances between noble families, the grudges simmering in the background, and the dangerous fault lines that ran beneath the English crown. In the grand halls of Westminster and the candle-lit chambers of her apartments, Isabella learned quickly that survival in this court required more than beauty and royal blood. It required patience, calculation, and the ability to use perception as a weapon. While Edward and Gaveston were absorbed in their personal world, Isabella quietly began preparing for a much longer game, one in which she would eventually turn England's own politics against those who sought to diminish her. It is here, at this juncture between a young girl's arrival and a queen's awakening, that the seeds of her black legend were sown. Her beauty and intelligence, rather than securing admiration, made her suspect in the eyes of those who feared women who could think and maneuver politically. And in the medieval mindset, where a clever woman was an unnatural woman, Suspicion often fermented into scandal. This was just the beginning. Soon, whispers would curl through the cold corridors, whispers that would mutate into accusations so grotesque they could ruin any royal reputation. And yet, Isabella would not only survive them, she would eventually learn to wield them as a tool of power. When Isabella of France first crossed the Channel to England in 1308, she carried with her the weight of two crowns' expectations. In the carefully choreographed theater of medieval politics, a royal marriage was more than a personal union, it was a living treaty. England expected her to be the perfect consort, a quiet adornment to the throne, a diplomatic bridge to France, and a mother to future kings. France, on the other hand, expected her to be a subtle agent of influence, someone who could temper English ambitions and secure French interests, but reality shattered those expectations almost immediately. London welcomed Isabella with pomp, but the warmth of the ceremonies could not disguise the chill in her personal reception. The English court, already divided and suspicious of foreign influence, eyed her as a French interloper. Worse, her new husband's heart belonged, quite openly, to someone else. Edward II's relationship with Piers Gaveston was no courtly secret. Gaveston had been banished by Edward's father, Edward I, for his undue influence over the prince. Yet one of the first acts Edward II performed as king was to recall Gaveston from exile and lavish him with titles and wealth. By the time Isabella arrived, Gaveston was already Earl of Cornwall, holding estates and privileges that should have strengthened the crown, but instead deepened resentment among the English nobility. Isabella's wedding day was meant to be a moment of splendor, a union that would solidify peace between two powerful kingdoms. Instead, it became a public stage for Edward's disregard. Chroniclers, with varying degrees of venom, reported how the king seemed to lavish more attention on Gaveston than on his bride. At the wedding banquet, Edward reportedly spent much of his time in private conversation with his favorite, leaving Isabella conspicuously isolated. Some accounts even claim that the costly gifts sent from France as part of Isabella's dowry, jewels, ornaments, silks, were handed over to Gaveston as tokens of the king's affection. To a young queen raised in the highly ceremonial French court, where appearances were everything, this was more than personal insult, it was political humiliation. Every noble present could see that the Queen of England was being sidelined, not by political necessity, but by the king's obsession with one man. Such slights, in the rigid hierarchy of medieval Europe, were not quickly forgotten or forgiven. And yet, Isabella's response was remarkable. Many young brides in similar circumstances withdrew into passivity, resigned to a life of ceremonial irrelevance. But Isabella had been trained from childhood in the art of royal survival. Her father, Philip IV, had raised his children in a court that was both a school and a crucible, where diplomacy was as sharp as any sword. She understood that humiliation, while painful, could also be instructive. Isabella began to study her surroundings with the quiet precision of a chess player memorizing the board. She noted the factions within the court, which barons were loyal to Edward, which tolerated him out of necessity, and which despised Gaveston enough to act against him. She learned who whispered in the corridors, who lingered near the council chamber doors, who laughed too quickly at the king's jokes, and who did not. Outside of court life, she observed the mood of the city. London was a restless place, its streets alive with merchants, craftsmen, and gossip. It was here that the first murmurs of discontent over Gaveston's influence could be heard, murmurs Isabella would later see magnified into open revolt. She also began forging her own relationships, carefully and discreetly. A kind word to the wife of a powerful earl here, a charitable gesture to the poor there, small acts that, over time, planted the seeds of loyalty in people beyond the king's immediate circle. She knew she could not yet confront Edward's neglect directly. Instead, she focused on building a foundation of influence that would serve her in the years to come. The tension between Edward and his barons over Gaveston's role grew steadily more dangerous. For Isabella, this was both a personal and political dilemma. Gaveston's dominance in the king's affections deprived her of status and agency as queen, but his unpopularity also presented an opportunity. If the barons moved against Gaveston, as they had in the past, she might be able to reclaim some measure of influence over the king, or at least over the narrative surrounding her place in the court. By the end of her first years in England, Isabella had learned two invaluable lessons. First, that personal humiliation could be a political resource if wielded with patience, and second, that in the English court appearances could be manipulated into weapons. It was a cold welcome, yes, but it was also an education in the brutal realities of power. And soon, those lessons would prove essential. For in the shadows of Westminster, the whispers about Isabella were already beginning small, sharp, and venomous. The kind of whispers that, once they found fertile ground, could grow into something monstrous. In the dim, echoing corridors of Westminster, rumor moved like smoke-thin, curling threads that slipped under doors and around corners, impossible to catch and harder still to dispel. At first, the whispers about Queen Isabella were subtle, the kind of idle court gossip that might attach itself to any royal figure who seemed aloof, to foreign, or too clever. Why, some murmured, did the young queen spend so much time locked away in her private chambers? Why was she often seen speaking in hushed tones with royal advisers rather than ladies-in-waiting? And why did she appear to care more about the politics of the realm than the needlework, prayers, and courtly duties expected of a queen? On the surface, these questions might have seemed harmless, but in a medieval court, curiosity about a queen's habits could quickly sour into suspicion, especially when that queen was foreign-born and politically astute. The English aristocracy was unused to women who wielded influence in matters of state, and when confronted with a woman whose mind was as sharp as any counselor's, they sought explanations rooted not in reason, but in the prejudices of the age. Medieval Europe had a ready-made set of accusations for powerful women. If she was clever beyond the expected bounds, she must be receiving her insight from unholy sources. If she was politically ambitious, she must be scheming through seduction or corruption. The English court reached instinctively for those familiar tropes, and soon the whispers began to take on a darker tone. Isabella was said to dabble in pagan rituals. She supposedly held secret meetings at night, illuminated only by flickering candles and the smell of incense, where strange symbols were traced and foreign words muttered. It is important to understand the mental world of the early 14th century to grasp just how dangerous such rumors were. The Church's hold over public thought was near absolute, and the boundary between political dissent and spiritual heresy was thin. To be accused of witchcraft, sorcery, or dealings with demons was not simply to be maligned, it was to be marked for destruction. Such charges could strip a person of credibility, legitimacy, and even their very right to live among Christian society. By 1315, the murmurs about Isabella's unusual habits had mutated into something far more sinister. Some claimed she was in contact with demonic forces, that her quick wit and political foresight were gifts not from God, but from infernal bargains. And then came the most grotesque slander of all whispers, that Isabella had engaged in acts of bestiality. The imagery was as deliberate as it was shocking. The daughter of the French king, consort to England's monarch, reduced in rumor to coupling with animals in the palace gardens. To a modern audience, such an accusation might seem so absurd as to be laughable. But in the 14th century, it was horrifyingly plausible to many. In medieval moral thinking, bestiality represented a kind of ultimate depravity, a sin that blurred the lines between humanity and animal, between God's order and nature's chaos. It was worse than adultery, worse than prostitution, and often spoken of in the same breath as heresy. A woman accused of such acts was not merely immoral, she was something less than human, unworthy of protection, and deserving of exile or death. These stories were not the natural result of idle gossip. They were seeded deliberately, crafted with care by those who understood how fear and disgust could be weaponized. They played upon every cultural reflex that medieval society had regarding women, foreigners, and sexuality. They exploited the church's obsession with purity, the aristocracy's fear of subversion, and the common people's appetite for sensational tales. Though no one could yet prove it, Isabella suspected even then that these rumors were not random. There was a mind behind them, a calculating, ruthless mind, and she was right. The architect of her coming ordeal would prove to be one of the most dangerous men in the realm, a man whose power depended entirely on removing Isabella from the political stage. But before the smear campaign could reach its zenith, Isabella made a choice that would define her survival. She did not deny the whispers. She knew that any denial would only feed them. Instead, she remained outwardly serene, going about her duties as queen with measured grace, as though the rumors were too ridiculous to merit response. Inwardly, though, she began to take note literally of who repeated the stories, who laughed at them, and who stood to gain from her humiliation. The war for Isabella's reputation had begun, and she was determined not to fight it as a cornered victim. She would fight it as a hunter. The man Isabella had quietly marked as her most dangerous enemy emerged fully into the spotlight after 1312, when Piers Gaveston's life ended on the executioner's block. Gaveston's arrogance had provoked the wrath of the English barons, and they had done what Isabella herself could not, removed him from Edward II's side. For a brief moment, she might have hoped for a reprieve, a chance to step into her rightful place as queen and political partner to the king. But Edward's need for a favorite, a confidant, perhaps even a surrogate ruler, was too deep to leave unfilled. Into the vacuum stepped Hugh Despenser the Younger, and with him, the true war for Isabella's survival began. Despenser was not merely ambitious, he was cold, calculating, and possessed of an almost predatory political instinct. He understood power as a game of territory, controlling the king's mind, controlling the flow of patronage, and, most dangerously for Isabella, controlling the narrative. Where Gaveston had been flamboyant and careless, Despenser was disciplined and deliberate. If Gaveston had alienated the barons through open disdain, Despenser would destroy his enemies through quiet annihilation. From the moment he secured the king's favor, Despenser recognized Isabella as a threat, not because she was Edward's wife. Edward's affection for her was negligible, but because she was a living link to the French crown, the daughter of Philip IV, and the sister to the reigning king of France. In a political climate where Anglo-French tensions simmered just below the surface, Isabella represented a bridge that Despenser could not control. To eliminate her influence, he needed more than political maneuvering. He needed to poison her reputation so thoroughly that her very presence would become suspect. He knew the English nobility already found her foreign blood unsettling, and her political intelligence unfeminine. All he had to do was fan those embers into a blaze. Despenser did not attack Isabella outright. Direct accusations could have rebounded against him. Instead, he worked through insinuation, planting small seeds of suspicion in the minds of those who mattered most: scribes, clerics, and minor courtiers whose words would ripple outward through the kingdom. "I find it curious," he would murmur over wine to a trusted ally, "how often the queen visits the stables at night. I am sure it is nothing, of course, but others have noticed." He would speak of her private audiences with certain advisers, remarking on their secrecy without ever suggesting a specific wrongdoing, at least not yet. The genius of such tactics lay in their subtlety. People invented their own conclusions, and those conclusions were always worse than anything explicitly stated. The rumors spread slowly at first, like a virus in incubation. But as they traveled from court to church, from noble halls to taverns, they began to mutate. What had started as curious habits became whispered tales of dark rituals, of animals kept for purposes too shameful to name, of midnight wanderings under the moon. By the time the stories had ripened, they were grotesque in detail. Supposed witnesses swore they had seen Isabella in the gardens with a stallion trained for unnatural purposes. Others claimed she had been seen with dogs, or that she had bathed in blood during pagan rites. Some said she consorted with witches to summon demons. others that she took the seed of animals to gain supernatural insight. The most lurid stories insisted she held orgies in moonlit groves, mingling man, beast, and sorcery. To a medieval audience, these were not the ramblings of madman, they were plausible signs of a woman corrupted beyond redemption. In an age when religious doctrine painted the female body as both tempting and dangerous, such allegations turned Isabella from a queen into something monstrous, something not even human. Despenser's genius was in layering the accusations. He didn't rely on a single, implausible tale, but wove together threads of existing prejudice, fear of foreign influence, fear of women in power, fear of the occult into a seamless tapestry of scandal. He didn't aim merely to shame Isabella, he aimed to strip her of all credibility. If she were no longer seen as a woman but as a creature of sin, no word she spoke, no alliance she formed, would carry weight. And for a time, it worked. Chroniclers recorded the stories with relish, repeating them as though they were indisputable truth. In the cloisters of monasteries and the smoky corners of alehouses, the Queen of England became the she-wolf, a figure of fascination and disgust. But Despenser, for all his cunning, made one miscalculation. He underestimated the woman he sought to destroy. Isabella, far from crumbling, was watching him as closely as he watched her. She could see the pattern in the rumors, the steady escalation of their content, the unmistakable fingerprints of someone pulling the strings. And while Despenser believed she was being cornered, she was quietly mapping her counterattack. In her mind, she was no longer the prey in his hunt, she was learning to become the hunter. By the late 1310s, Hugh Despenser's campaign had reached fever pitch. What had begun as sly insinuation now erupted into grotesque legend. Isabella was no longer just a queen with questionable habits, she was the she-wolf of France. The transformation in public perception was deliberate and complete. In this new mythology, Isabella was not only accused of bestiality, but of becoming a beast herself. English chroniclers, fueled by gossip and eager to please Despenser's faction, spun tales that blurred the line between woman and monster. She was said to take the shape of a wolf beneath the full moon, to howl through the forests, her claws dripping with blood. Some claimed she lured children into the woods to devour them. Others insisted she led covens of witches who mixed animal seed with the blood of virgins in obscene rituals to conjure demonic power. It was medieval horror propaganda at its most effective, rich in sensory detail, impossible to disprove, and endlessly repeatable. In an age when most people could not read and relied on oral storytelling, the more outrageous the rumor, the more it stuck. By the time these stories reached England's villages and taverns, they were recounted as if they were eyewitness testimony. The brilliance of the smear lay in its cultural precision. Despenser and his allies weaponized every medieval fear, witchcraft, unnatural sexuality, foreign corruption, and the chaos of the untamed wilderness. They didn't just want Isabella out of the way, they wanted her name so blackened that even in memory she would be despised. But Isabella was not the sort of woman to disappear quietly into disgrace. She had grown up in the court of Philip the Fair, where politics was a blood sport and image was as potent a weapon as any sword. She understood instinctively that denying such accusations would only feed them. In the medieval mind, a strong denial was almost as good as a confession. It meant you had something to hide. So she did the opposite. She walked the corridors of Westminster with her head high, meeting the eyes of those who whispered behind their hands. She smiled not the smile of a woman broken, but of a woman who knew something her enemies did not. By refusing to acknowledge the rumors, she made them seem beneath her notice, an act of quiet defiance that unsettled those who had expected her to panic. In private, however, Isabella was far from idle. She began keeping her own mental ledger of who repeated the stories and who seemed to benefit from their spread. Allies of Despenser were quietly marked. Wavering nobles were noted as potential converts to her cause. Every banquet, every council meeting became an opportunity to gather intelligence. She was not merely surviving the smear campaign, she was turning it into reconnaissance for her eventual counterattack. Her strategy worked in ways Despenser could not foresee. The very absurdity of the rumors eventually began to strain credulity. Educated courtiers, while still wary of her influence, started to doubt the more fantastical claims. It was one thing to accuse a queen of witchcraft. It was another to insist she prowled the woods in lupin form. The whispers were still potent, but now there were cracks in the wall Despenser had built around her. Isabella saw those cracks and began to think not just of survival, but of reversal. If the English court had cast her as a she-wolf, then perhaps she could take the name and make it her own, turn the symbol of a monster into that of a predator. A wolf might be feared, but it was also respected. And unlike a lamb, a wolf was never a victim. It was a dangerous gamble, but Isabella was no stranger to risk. She would bide her time, waiting for the moment when her enemies' overconfidence would make them careless. And when that moment came, the she-wolf would bare her teeth not in shame, but in triumph. That opportunity arrived in the form of a diplomatic mission that seemed, at first, to be a banishment. Edward II and Hugh Despenser, thinking they had found a way to remove her from English politics, sent her to negotiate peace with France. They could not have guessed that this journey would become the beginning of their undoing. The year was 1324, and tensions between England and France had erupted into the short but consequential War of Saints Ardos. To most of Edward II's council, the conflict was just another flare-up in the long-running rivalry over Gascony. But for Hugh Despenser, it was an opportunity. If Isabella could be sent to France under the guise of diplomacy, she would be removed from the center of English politics and, perhaps, from her remaining allies at court. On the surface, the idea was brilliant. The queen, already tainted by years of scandal, would be dispatched to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV of France, the very man with whom England was now at odds. If the talks failed, blame could easily be pinned on her. If they succeeded, the credit would be claimed by the king and his ministers. Either way, Despenser would be rid of her physical presence in London, where her quiet influence still made him uneasy. Edward II, blinded by his trust in Despenser, agreed. And so, in March 1325, Isabella set sail for France? To many, it looked like the end of her relevance in England's affairs, but Isabella knew better. She was returning to her homeland, a place where she was not a maligned foreigner, but the beloved daughter of Philip the Fair, the princess whose beauty and poise had once charmed all of Paris. Stepping once again onto French soil, Isabella felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not in danger, but in possibility. She was no longer cornered by the hostile gossip of the English court. She was surrounded by people who remembered her as she had been before Despenser's lies, radiant, clever, and royal to her core. The French court did not see a she-wolf. They saw a queen unjustly diminished by an unworthy husband and his parasitic favorite. Isabella wasted no time in turning her diplomatic mission into a strategic masterpiece. Her first move was simple, elegant, and devastating in its implications. She persuaded her brother Charles IV that the future King of England, her 12-year-old son, Edward of Windsor, should come to France to pay homage for the English-held lands in Gascony. It was a standard feudal obligation, and Edward II could hardly refuse without insulting both his wife and the French crown. When young Edward arrived in Paris in September 1325, the game changed entirely. In one stroke, Isabella had removed the heir to the English throne from Despenser's reach and placed him under her own protection. The boy was not just her son, he was now the living embodiment of her legitimacy, a banner around which discontented English nobles could rally. Then came her boldest declaration. When Edward II demanded she return to England, Isabella replied with words that would echo for centuries, "I will not return while the wolf remains in the fold." It was a master stroke of rhetoric. For years, she had been mocked as the she-wolf. Now, she turned the metaphor back on her enemies, painting Hugh Despenser as the true predator, the corrupting beast in the royal flock. The English court was stunned. This was not the voice of a cowed, scandal-ridden queen. This was the voice of a woman who had taken control of her own narrative, using the very language of her defamers as a weapon. Nobles who had once whispered about her supposed depravity now began to see her as a victim of Despencer's greed and cruelty. Some even began to wonder if the monstrous image painted of her had been a fabrication all along. It was at this moment that fate introduced Isabella to the man who would become both her lover and her co-conspirator, Roger Mortimer, a powerful marcher lord who had been exiled after rebelling against Edward II. Mortimer was a seasoned warrior and a shrewd political operator. Like Isabella, he had been driven from England by Despencer's rise. Like Isabella, he burned for revenge. In the opulent halls of the French court, their alliance was forged not in whispers or shadows, but in plain view. They dined together, plotted together, and, to the scandal of both England and France, became lovers without attempting to hide it. To their enemies, it was proof of Isabella's moral corruption. To their supporters, it was the union of two wronged nobles fighting to reclaim their power. Either way, it made the old rumors about her seem suddenly irrelevant. Why fabricate tales of moonlit rituals and animal lovers when the Queen herself had given her enemies a scandal they could actually prove? It was a calculated risk on Isabella's part, and it worked. The narrative shifted from fantastical monstrosity to tangible defiance, a dangerous but human form of rebellion that English nobles could understand. The she-wolf had found her mate, and together they were about to rewrite the rules of medieval power. Roger Mortimer was not just another disaffected noble. He was a man who had tasted both the heights of royal favor and the depths of political ruin. Born into one of the most powerful marcher families, he had commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and navigated the volatile frontier between England and Wales. But his rebellion against Edward II and Hugh Despencer had cost him everything: his lands, his titles, and his freedom. After a daring escape from the Tower of London, he had fled to France, where he became a guest and eventually an ally of the French crown. When Isabella met Mortimer in the French court, their shared hatred of Despencer was immediate common ground. But what began as a political alliance quickly became something more. Chroniclers, even those hostile to Isabella, admitted that the pair were rarely apart. They plotted openly, their conversations laced with equal measures of strategy and intimacy. For the first time in years, Isabella had a partner who saw her not as a pawn or a liability, but as an equal. Their affair was a scandal in both kingdoms. In medieval Europe, a queen's adultery was a political crime as much as a moral one. It could undermine the legitimacy of her children and tarnish the honor of the crown. Yet Isabella did not attempt to conceal the relationship. This was calculated defiance. The rumors of her past, those grotesque inventions of witchcraft and bestiality, began to lose their potency. After all, why conjure up tales of supernatural depravity when the Queen herself had committed the far more believable and far more human sin of loving her husband's enemy? Isabella understood the psychology of scandal. An accusation that was too outrageous could be doubted. One that was scandalous but plausible would stick. By controlling the kind of scandal she was associated with, she redirected the conversation. The English nobles could forgive adultery if it served the realm's interests, especially when the alternative was to keep suffering under Edward II and Despencer's tyranny. Mortimer, for his part, brought more to the table than romance. He was a skilled military commander, and his exile had given him time to cultivate alliances among other English exiles and discontented lords. He also had the experience of someone who had fought Despencer before and knew the weaknesses of Edward's regime. Together, they began to weave a network of support that spanned from the French court to the disillusioned barons of England. Their relationship also gave Isabella something she had lacked for years: a partner willing to take risks alongside her. The Queen, who had once walked the halls of Westminster alone, now had someone who could match her daring. In their private meetings, whether in candlelit chambers of the French royal palace or in secluded gardens shielded from prying eyes, they spoke not just of revenge, but of reclamation. They envisioned an England without Despencer, without Edward II, perhaps even an England guided by the young Edward III under their joint regency. The English crown, for all its grandeur, was rotting from within. Despencer's greed had alienated powerful lords. His seizure of lands and arbitrary justice had turned allies into enemies. Edward II, increasingly isolated, seemed blind to the discontent festering beneath him. Isabella and Mortimer knew that if they could present themselves as the righteous alternative, a queen fighting for her son, and a noble fighting to restore justice, they could win support for something unprecedented, a queen-led invasion of her own kingdom. It was audacious, even unthinkable. Medieval queens were not supposed to lead armies, overthrow kings, or dictate policy. But Isabella had long since abandoned the rules written for her by men who wanted her silent. Now, with Mortimer at her side, she was ready to turn the image of the she-wolf into a rallying cry. In the salons of Paris, they began to speak of it in hushed tones, the return to England not as supplicants, but as conquerors. The plan would require money, troops, ships, and above all, timing. Every move had to be calculated, but the queen and her lover were patient predators. They would wait, they would prepare, and when they struck, it would be with precision. By the end of 1325, Isabella was no longer the isolated queen at the mercy of her husband's court. She was a political force in her own right, an exiled sovereign gathering her army in the shadows. And England, though it did not yet know it, was only a year away from the day the she-wolf would come home to hunt. By mid-1326, the plan Isabella and Mortimer had been carefully shaping for months was ready to leave the realm of whispered conspiracy and take form in steel. For the first time in centuries, a queen of England was about to lead a military campaign against her own husband. To Isabella, it was not treason, it was justice, and, more importantly, it was survival. The conditions in England had ripened perfectly for her return. Hugh Despencer's greed had reached new heights, stripping lands from powerful nobles, imprisoning rivals without trial, and even targeting the families of those who opposed him. Edward II, deeply dependent on his favorite, had alienated nearly all the great lords. The kingdom's elite simmered with resentment, and the common people were no less discontent. Taxes had risen, trade suffered, and famine years earlier had left scars that still ached. From her base in France, Isabella reached out to the exiled English barons and those still in England who dared defy the king in secret. She offered them a simple bargain: stand with me and my son, the rightful heir, and together we will rid England of the Despensers. Her status as mother to the heir gave her a legitimacy no other rebel leader could claim. She wasn't seeking the throne for herself, at least. Not openly. She was restoring the crown to her son. With French royal approval quietly secured, Isabella and Mortimer began gathering men and ships. But France would not supply the bulk of her army. That would come from Flanders, where mercenaries could be hired without embroiling the French crown in direct war. Gold, promises, and personal charisma drew together a force of perhaps 1,500 men, small for an invasion. But Isabella understood that this was not about overwhelming numbers. It was about momentum. Once she landed and nobles began defecting, the army would swell on English soil. On September 24, 1326, Isabella's fleet crossed the Channel and landed at Orwell in Suffolk. The reception was not hostile, it was jubilant. Her arrival had been anticipated by those weary of Edward and his favorite. Nobles who had long kept their discontent private now rode openly to her banner. Among the first to join her was Henry of Lancaster, cousin to the king and one of the most powerful magnates in the realm. When he knelt before Isabella and pledged his sword not to Edward, but to her and her son, it was a signal to all of England that the balance of power had shifted. From Suffolk, Isabella and her growing host began a deliberate march toward London. Towns opened their gates. Villages brought provisions. There was no grinding campaign, no need for prolonged sieges. Every day brought new defections from Edward's side, and every mile they advanced made Despencer's position more precarious. Edward II and Hugh Despencer were caught off guard by the speed of her advance. Instead of rallying forces to meet her, they fled west toward Wales, seeking the safety of Despencer's strongholds. It was a move that, more than any battle, destroyed the king's image. A monarch fleeing his own queen, his own wife, without a fight looked weak, cowardly, and unworthy of the crown. In London, unrest exploded into open revolt. Riots broke out, Despenser's allies were attacked, and prisoners long held for opposing the regime were freed. When Isabella entered the capital on October 2nd, she was greeted not as an enemy invader, but as a liberator. The same woman who had once been derided as a devil-worshipping pervert was now hailed as the savior of the realm. It was an extraordinary reversal. Years of careful image crafting by Despenser had painted her as inhuman, dangerous, and unfit for power. Yet here she was, walking through cheering crowds, her young son at her side, wearing the calm smile of a ruler who knows her cause is just. She had turned the slander into a mantle, the she-wolf now leading her pack. But Isabella understood that the campaign was not over. As long as Edward and Despenser remained at large, her victory was incomplete. Their capture would not only end their political power, but send a message to anyone who might dare to challenge her, and for that, she was prepared to pursue them to the ends of the kingdom. The hunt for Edward II and Hugh Despenser the Younger began almost as soon as Isabella had secured London. She knew that as long as they roamed free, the crown itself was unstable. Both men had fled westward toward Wales, a land of rugged mountains, remote castles, and fiercely loyal retainers perfect terrain for hiding. But Isabella was relentless. She put a price on their heads. £1,000 for the king, 500 for Despenser. In modern terms, these were sums worth millions, and they turned every noble, knight, and opportunist into a potential bounty hunter. Edward and Despenser's flight was a desperate, stumbling retreat. They moved from stronghold to stronghold, each one less defensible than the last, hoping to find a port from which they could escape to Ireland. But their followers were dwindling. Even their own household knights, tempted by Isabella's reward, began to waver. The first major break came when Hugh Despenser, the elder father of the king's favourite, was captured at Bristol. Though the elder Despenser had not been the architect of the smear campaign against Isabella, he was none the less a symbol of her enemies. His execution was swift and public, his body displayed as a warning. But it was nothing compared to the fate Isabella reserved for Hugh the Younger. When Despenser was finally captured in November 1326, Isabella made certain his end would be remembered. He was paraded before her, filthy, gaunt, and trembling, his fine clothes replaced by a coarse tunic. There would be no quiet execution. This would be a spectacle of vengeance. He was condemned not just for treason, but for the full measure of his crimes: greed, tyranny, and the calculated destruction of the Queen's reputation. The execution took place at Hereford before a massive crowd. Despenser was first hanged, but cut down while still alive, the rope leaving a burning mark on his neck. He was then subjected to the punishment reserved for the most despised traitors: castration, disembowelment, and quartering. His genitals were burned before his eyes, his heart and entrails torn out, and his remains sent to the four corners of the realm. It was theater as much as justice, a gruesome demonstration of what awaited anyone who tried to destroy Isabella of France. Edward II's fate, however, was different. He was captured not long after Despenser's death, betrayed by those he still trusted. When brought before Isabella, he was no longer the confident king who had once humiliated her at their wedding. He was broken, dressed in black like a mourner at his own funeral. Isabella did not have him killed, not yet. Even in victory, she understood the dangerous precedent of regicide. To kill a reigning king outright was to risk the wrath of God and the legitimacy of the crown. Instead, she orchestrated a performance of political theater. In January 1327, Edward II was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, now crowned Edward III. The ceremony was carefully staged. Isabella wore the royal colors, standing beside her son, the embodiment of rightful continuity. Edward II, in black, stepped forward to relinquish the crown, a living symbol of his own failure. It was a master stroke. Isabella emerged not as a usurper, but as a regent, the dutiful mother guiding her young son until he was old enough to rule. The same chroniclers who had once called her a witch and a beast now recorded her as the savior of England. The public humiliation was complete for both Edward and the ghost of Hugh Despenser. But Isabella knew this was only the penultimate act of her drama. As long as Edward II lived, he remained a potential rallying point for her enemies. The she-wolf had claimed the pack, but one loose thread still dangled in the dangerous game of medieval power. Loose threads could unravel everything. The winter of 1327 passed, with Edward II confined under heavy guard, moved between castles in the Welsh borderlands and the Midlands. Officially, he was a former king living under secure protection. In truth, he was a dangerous stability, a living banner for any faction bold enough to challenge Isabella's regency. For all her calculated triumphs, Isabella understood that power in the Middle Ages was never safe so long as a deposed monarch drew breath. By September, the inevitable happened. Word spread that Edward II was dead. The official story was neat and clean. He had succumbed to illness while in custody at Berkeley Castle. There were no wounds on the body, no signs of struggle. His face was serene, his form intact. It was, on the surface, a death suitable for a fallen king, a quiet passing into obscurity. But almost immediately, rumors began to ripple through England and beyond. Some whispered of a more gruesome truth, that Edward had been murdered in a way designed to leave no visible marks. The tale was as specific as it was chilling: a red-hot iron rod inserted into his rectum, burning him from the inside out. No blade, no bruises, no outward evidence, only an untraceable agony. The symbolism was unmistakable. For years, Edward had been mocked for his relationships with men, especially his notorious favoritism toward Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser. To kill him in such a way was to turn the slurs of his enemies into his final humiliation, a death that mocked the life they claimed he had lived. Whether or not the method was true hardly mattered. In the Middle Ages, the story itself carried the power. Historians still debate the truth of Edward II's end. Some argue the murder story was propaganda, either to frighten Isabella's opponents or to stain Edward's memory further. Others believe it was entirely possible, even likely, given the political stakes and the brutal creativity of medieval executions. What is certain is the timing. His death removed the last serious threat to Isabella's control, just as her hold over the realm began to settle. With Despenser executed and Edward gone, Isabella entered the height of her regency. She ruled England alongside Roger Mortimer, her lover and co-conspirator, wielding more direct authority than any English queen before her. For a few short years, it seemed she had rewritten the rules entirely, proof that a woman could seize power in her own right, not merely inherit it. But history has a way of turning on its masters. Isabella's son, Edward III, was growing into a young man, keen-eyed and ambitious. He had watched his mother's rise, her intrigues, and her alliance with Mortimer. And while he owed his crown to her, he also understood that one day he would have to reclaim authority from her. The she-wolf had overthrown a king, destroyed her enemies, and ruled in her son's name. Yet she would learn that the most dangerous rival is not the one you topple from the throne, but the one you raise to sit on it. That, however, was the next chapter of her legend, the chapter where the hunter would feel the jaws of another wolf closing in.